Hey everybody, Charles from GMATNinja here. Welcome to our session on inconsistent GMAT scores, why your practice test scores, why your actual test scores are all over the place. This is the kickoff event to the August 2022 version of MBA Spotlight. This is the student-centered spotlight. So if you're watching us live, really important thing I want you to be aware of, I'll try to bring it up a couple more times during this hour. These are not recorded. This session is. If you want to go talk to some students from the school of your choice, those are Zoom sessions, not recorded. This is your chance, no holds barred. Get to know students from schools that you're interested in, hear the straight dope on what's going on at those schools. Nobody's going to hear about it later. You can ask absolutely anything. Please don't miss those sessions. Those are going to be great. Even if you're still studying for the GMAT, you're not quite ready to do your applications yet. This is a great opportunity to learn about schools you're interested in and really hear what goes on, get some insights into admissions and what culture is like on campus. So with that, today I'm here to talk about inconsistent GMAT scores, why your scores are all over the place. My inbox fills every single day with students, with people on GMAT Club who are saying, hey, my test scores, hey, I got a 720 on my last practice exam, went and took the actual test, it was a 600, what happened? So one thing we see all the time, this huge gap between your practice test scores and your actual test score related. Sometimes we just see people who haven't taken the test yet, but their practice test scores are all over the map. They might see a 50-point or an 80-point or 120-point discrepancy, or a ton of variation in just their verbal score, a ton of variation in just their quant score. When that happens, that's a problem. You got to fix it. So we're going to talk about what the 4 biggest things that drive that problem, that drive that inconsistency between either your practice test scores or that gap between your practice test scores and your actual test scores. I'm going to go through a quick presentation. I'm going to show you guys 4 students that we've worked with that show all those signs of test scores that are just blowing in the breeze. Talk about 4 reasons why that happens. Please ask your questions. I'm going to try my best to keep an eye on the live chat if you're watching us live, and we'll do a nice Q&A for about somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes afterwards, but depending on how long-winded I get with the presentation. So with that, all right. So like I said, I'm going to show you 4 students anonymized. I'm not going to give you their names, obviously. And hopefully some of you guys watching this will see yourselves in these scores. So right here, we've got somebody scoring in the low to mid 600s on his practice test. Not too bad. Gets to the actual exam, boom, 470, absolutely tragic verbal score. This is a native speaker, by the way, really smart guy. And the question is, what happened here? One of the things that I wished he had noticed before going in for his actual GMAT exam is look at all that variability in his verbal test scores just on his practice test. Something's going on there that he needed to take a look at that's driving a much bigger drop when he actually got to his test. A little later on, I'll explain exactly what was going on with this guy and what we did about it. Student number 2. So some really good test scores in here, cracked a 710 on a practice test, some really high quant scores. But again, look at those verbal scores, blowing in the breeze, way more variability than we want to see just on those practice test scores alone. Gets to the actual test, gets disappointed again and again. Not necessarily the hugest drop off. That 640 isn't absolutely terrible, but it's 70 points from his actual test. And again, this is another super talented student. Comes in and asks us, hey, is there any hope for me? I've taken the test 4 times, can't crack a 640. Where's my ceiling? What's my ability level? Am I just terrible at this stuff? The answer here is no. This guy is not terrible at this stuff at all. Really talented fellow. Very specific set of problems going on that we're still working on helping him fix. Maybe this one rings a bell for you. More of those kind of mid 600 scores. Not too bad. Two test scores, fairly consistent. Low to mid 40s on quant, low to mid 30s on verbal. All right. And then she gets to her actual exams, 540, 420. And you're reading that right, guys. That's a 6 on verbal. 6. I didn't even know that was possible until I met the student a few years ago. Got a 6 on verbal. You actually have to do worse than blind guessing. You have to actually fall into traps kind of almost on purpose. Really remarkable score. Haven't seen anything like that since. This one has a happy ending. I'll get into that in a minute. But again, 3rd student, 3rd very specific thing causing a whole lot of trouble. And inconsistent GMAT student number 4. Whole lot of practice tests. Super hardworking guy. I actually left some of the practice tests out of here. Did piles and piles of Veritas tests, Manhattan tests, GMAT Club tests. Look at the variability again in those verbal scores here. A little bit in the quant, but certainly in the verbal scores, something funny is going on. And then, of course, you see the same thing on the actual test. A lot of variability. What's driving that? And this student had that same kind of question. Hey, am I hopeless? I can't seem to crack a 680 on his first attempt. I really want a 720, 740, 750. Is there any chance I can ever achieve that? looking at these scores, you might say, well, maybe not, but it turns out that this is more a story about inconsistency, a very specific factor driving that inconsistency. And this guy fixes that issue, his scores start going up. All right. So the four things that so if you're seeing some of these patterns in your own scores, whether you've taken the actual GMAT or not, if you're seeing this kind of thing, here's four broad categories of things that might be driving all that variability. Problem number one, see this really, really often, practice test abuse. Now, I mean a whole bunch of different things by this. Number one, are you retaking tests? That's a really common one. Maybe your official MBA.com tests are inflated. Maybe you're relying too much on non-official tests. They're not always accurate. They might be good practice. I really like the GMAT Club test, for example, for quant. Verbal, different story. But often those scores aren't necessarily accurate. It's really, 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 really hard for test prep companies to mimic the actual style of the exam. GMAT spends several $1,000s developing each individual test question. I'll repeat that again, several $1,000s on each individual test question. Test prep companies, GMAT Club, nobody can compete with that. The tests just aren't as good. They can't be. They might be good for you. You only have the 6 official practice tests. But if you're relying too much on those non-official practice tests, sometimes you get a warped idea in your head about what the test is really like, number one. And number two, you might get a really, really warped idea of where you stand. So we've had people come in and say, yeah, my test scores are in the mid 700s. I take the actual test and all of a sudden I'm at 650. What happened? And it turns out they were doing some non-official test over and over, and it just wasn't accurate for them. So that's a second factor, non-official test, not great for you. If you've seen the test before, obviously it's going to inflate your score. If you've seen the questions before, that's going to inflate your score. And if you're pausing the test, that's another thing we see way too often. That can mess with your score. Then you get to your actual exam and you're shocked by the experience. So GMAT student number one here, really, really smart guy, super accomplished fellow, native speaker with his 17 verbal score. And what was going on here? Yeah, I don't like that variability from the start, but it turns out this guy had really, really, really goofy ideas about how to practice. So he kept retaking the tests over and over. He'd memorize the questions, just study the living crap out of them, memorize those questions. He was pausing the tests. He was doing a ton of non-official tests. The pausing in particular, you do that once or twice and it totally changes the experience. Never, ever, ever hit a pause button on a practice test. It's going to ruin the practice test for you. And you can say, well, it was only 2 minutes. Totally changes it. Part of what the GMAT is time pressure. You start to alleviate that. It's a different exam. So this guy's skills were actually pretty close to the 470 level. So his tutor started working with him thinking, yeah, there's some inconsistency here. We'll work on that. And then realized what he was doing with the practice test, and his skills were really kind of around that 470 level. So for this particular guy, it was a lot of slow building back up of his abilities. And, within a few months, we had him, doing pretty well, scoring around a 700 on his practice test again. And he's still working on the test. But in this case, frankly, the practice test lied. This guy was never at the 600s level, certainly never a 730 level. He was just taking the practice test in a way that was totally inauthentic to the GMAT experience. And his skills were really much closer to that 470 than they ever were to a 630 or a 730. All right. Factor number two, ignoring your body. Nobody wants to hear this. People come for GMAT tutoring or they come to GMAT Club and you think, hey, give me the geometry formulas. I'm going to memorize all the idioms. I'm going to memorize the stuff. Great. But if you're not sleeping, you're not eating, you're going to walk in on test day and underperform. That's what happened to this guy over and over and over. One of the hardest working people we've ever met. I think I told a story in a previous MBA Spotlight about a fellow who studied so long and so hard as an undergraduate. So at university, this guy literally slept in the library at his university for several nights, drank a ton of energy drinks, ton of caffeine, stayed up. His eyes got so dry, he cracked his cornea. I'm not making this up. That's how hardworking this guy is. Smart dude, incredible career progress, amazing guy. But he works himself so freaking hard that, yeah, his scores are unstable. He forgets to eat. He doesn't sleep. His performance blows in the breeze. Take care of your body. We don't let our students study for more than 3 or 4 hours a day. And that's if they're not working full time. That's on the weekends on a work day. If you go to the office, we don't want you studying for more than 2. Keep the balance. Take care of your body. It sounds really, really silly. We've got a ton of resources up on the GMATNinja website. We refer people to personal trainers and nutritionists if they need to have a great sleep coach. If you watched our Ukraine marathon back in March 2022, we did a little mini panel with a personal trainer and a sleep coach talking about how taking care of your body can improve your mental performance. You're not going to get any awards for studying until you crack your cornea or studying until you fall over. Get some sleep, people. It sounds really, really silly, but it's actually one of the most common problems we see is you're working yourself so hard thinking that that's going to get you something in the end. Hard work's good. Hard work's fine. Take care of your body, get some rest. This guy's still working on it. He's got a lot of habits to break, and it's really, really tough for him to, get off work, not study too hard, and get to bed at a decent hour. Great debrief that just popped up, by the way, on the GMAT Club forum, and maybe somebody on the GMAT Club team, if you can find it. Fellow, I think, started at 680 or 690. Realized that sleep was a huge, huge problem. Did a bunch of research into circadian rhythms. Trained himself to sleep better over the course of several weeks. Got a 770. Credit sleep for that boost from a 690 to a 770 in just a few weeks. And that's legit. Obviously, this is somebody with incredible skills, but he or she was losing 80 points or so because of a lack of sleep. Got that figured out, made a nice little leap. And if anybody's watching that can find that debrief and pop it into the chat, I would love that. All right. Issue number 3 out of 4, test anxiety. This is a huge, huge, huge one. I would say at this point, 70 or 80% of the students we meet at GMATNinja are suffering from test anxiety on some level. You don't necessarily need to feel consciously anxious. You don't necessarily need to have your heart beating, palm sweaty, anything like that to be feeling the effects of test anxiety enough. Sometimes you're not conscious of it, but your brain gets foggy, have a hard time concentrating, can take many, many forms. Sometimes people aren't aware of it. That's totally, totally normal. Test anxiety is incredibly common. It's a sign that you care. If you care about this test, you're going to get a little bit of butterfly in your stomach. It's a good thing. All top performers at all sorts of fields do get those butterflies in their stomach. The question is, can you be aware of it? Learn to get it under control enough for yourself to perform well. And this woman who is a legend internally for us, because we were really, really leery of whether we could even help her through tutoring. We said, wait a minute, you're at a 23 on your better verbal test, and you got a 6 verbal, and her goal was a 700 plus, and she wanted to go to an Ivy League MBA program. We weren't sure we could help just looking at these scores, because we looked at those verbal scores and just went, something's going on here. Maybe her reading skills are just appallingly bad. Not true. Turns out her reading skills are great. And it had nothing to do with her academic abilities. If anything, quant might have limited her a little bit here. She actually had a harder time getting above kind of the mid 40s in quant. Verbal skills were fantastic. This was a story about anxiety. She was walking to the test, freaking out hard. So she really took on the challenge that we set for her and said, okay, let's try to figure out what's going to work for you to help get you regulated on test day. She really embraced mindfulness coaching, which is one of many different ways you might go about addressing test anxiety. Sports psychologists sometimes do great work with this. We have one on staff at GMATNinja now. We have a meditation coach as well who has a PhD in psychology. And this student really embraced the challenge of becoming of mindfulness and meditation, and really being aware of her own feelings in her body and figuring out how to calm herself down when she was under stress and kind of reset her brain so that she could refocus on the question that was in front of her. Did an amazing, amazing, amazing job with it. Got her 700 in the end, and ended up at that Ivy League MBA program. And this is obviously atypical. We didn't teach. I'd love to say, yeah, we taught her 34 points worth of great stuff on verbal. That's total BS. That's not what happened. She came in with really good skills. We polished them up a little bit. But she really took on the challenge for herself of figuring out what makes her tick psychologically and how to reduce that anxiety on test day. Don't run from this, everybody. This is one of those things where we'll sometimes say to students, yeah, when we see this pattern of scores, we're very, very suspicious that something's going on where you're freaking out on test day. A lot of people don't want to hear it. It's stigmatized. Don't be ashamed of it. Almost everybody feels this way. Almost everybody at least gets those jitters on test day. If that's true for you, think about, at the bare minimum, trying some mindfulness meditation. Personally, meditation is not my cup of tea. I don't enjoy it. That's not my thing. But I also recognize there's a ton of research backing. It improves your performance enormously, even if you don't have test anxiety. If you do, it's one of the simplest things you can do. Go get one of the apps that's out there, Headspace or Calm or one of those. Start meditating and see if that helps your anxiety a little bit. If you need more help than that, there's plenty of resources online. All right, factor number 4, just an unsystematic approach to GMAT questions in general. This is actually the hardest one for me to summarize quickly in a video like this, but this fellow, pretty consistent on quant. I'd like to see a little more consistency there, but not too bad. Verbal, he came in after maybe a year and a half of studying on his own and had worked really, really hard on it. And you kind of see those scores blowing the breeze a little bit on his practice test. I don't like to see a 7-point gap from one verbal test to another. Actual GMAT, yeah, now we're seeing an 11-point gap. That's not a shock. You see even more of it if somebody is fundamentally unsystematic. His question for us is there any hope? Am I just stuck at a 680 and there's no hope that I ever get into the mid 700s? Looked under the hood a little bit. Turns out this guy's actually a really, really good reader, really talented guy, really good logic on something like critical reasoning, had studied the crap out of sentence correction, really knew his stuff. Now, his problem was he was doing different things at different times. So reading comprehension, for example, he would just speed up and start going through really, really quickly sometimes. And then that would slow him down. He'd have time management problems because if he read the passage too fast, he'd spend an eternity going back and forth between question, passage. So if you watch any of our reading comp videos, you'll hear me say what you're going for is that optimal speed on reading comprehension so that you're reading it the same way every time, looking for the same things every time. And if you can get that dialed in, you're going to start to see this variability go away. And we could say something similar about every question type. We could say that about quant. We could say that about sentence correction, critical reasoning. In his case, reading comp is the thing that stands out to me because it really messed with his time management because he was so inconsistent in his approach. Sometimes he would say, I'm going to skim this one today, and the wheels would come off. And the next time he would overread it and the wheels would come off because it would spend too much time and not really get the big picture. So once he started working on that, he started to see a lot of improvement. And again, same thing for him on sentence correction, critical reasoning, really erratic in his approach, did different things on different days, didn't train in a way that built systematicness. And if he had done that, he would have saved himself a whole lot of pain. Super talented guy, still working on it, but because he's still going through his studies here. But he's got a really good shot, and the talent again is there. And that was his number one question: is, hey guys, if I'm hopeless, please just tell me. And sometimes the answer is, yeah, you're a bad reader, and I'm worried about you. In his case, it's, well, your ceiling is really high. We got to rein in your process because that's what's driving all this variability. All right. So these are your 4 biggest reasons why your scores are flying all over the place. Practice test abuse. The data doesn't mean what you think it means. Ignoring your body. Get some sleep. Get some exercise. Keep your blood sugar stable. You don't need to be super, fitness guy or anything, but just make sure you're getting some sleep. Don't try to tough your way through. The GMAT's going to pick up on it if you're tired. Test anxiety, really, really big thing. Be honest with yourself about it. Finally, unsystematic approach to questions. And that's a whole other ball of wax. But every video I think we've ever done on the GMAT Club channel, the GMATNinja YouTube channel, this is what we talk about. How do you become more systematic in your approach to everything, especially verbal? It's huge. If you're seeing a lot of variability, you need to really ask yourself, wait a minute, am I really doing the same thing every time? Or every time I see, let's say, a reading comp passage, am I trying to do something different and coming at it with a different mindset? Those are 4 things to keep an eye on. All right. That's all I've got as far as the presentation. And I'm happy to stay, until another 40, 45 minutes here if you guys have questions. So if you're watching this live, please fire away. Before I get into some of the user questions, and we can go ahead and remove this guy. Once again, this is the, for those who did miss the introduction at the beginning, kickoff event, MBA Spotlight, August 2022. This is the student-centric version. So if you join any of these live sessions, aside from this one, not going to be recorded. You're on Zoom with students and alumni who know what goes on at the school, have all sorts of insights. You can ask them anything. So even if you're not sure where you want to apply, you're not ready to apply, you're not done with the GMAT, please join those sessions. Ask anything. This is your chance. No one's going to hear about it later, not recorded. It's totally private. So please go enjoy those. If that means that everybody watching live bails and goes and watches the session that starts in 10 minutes, that's great. Learn what's really going on at these schools. It's a rare, rare opportunity to do that. Start your networking off with a bang. All right. Start taking some of these questions from the live audience. This is a really good one. And I apologize if I slaughter names here. Kusnior, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation. Are there any stories where a student did better on an actual test than he did on practice tests? Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm having a hard time getting it up on the screen, but that's okay. So does it ever go the opposite direction? So a lot of this video, a lot of the problem that we end up spending a lot of time solving as tutors, and we see a lot of in GMAT Club, is your actual test was worse than your practice test. Does this ever go the opposite way? Yes, it's exceedingly rare, unfortunately, but it happens. And I think it's kind of under 2 circumstances. One is that every once in a while we get somebody who's a really, really kind of fundamentally steady performer, but they don't necessarily bring all of their energy to the practice tests, no matter how much we yell at them. That's a bad idea. You should take practice tests exactly like they're the real thing. Sounds like a really obvious thing. For some people, it's hard to fully dial in when they know it doesn't matter as much, right? And again, for most people, that works in the opposite direction. They get to the actual one, it really matters, and all of a sudden, that's where the test anxiety comes from. But I can think of some really, a couple of really good stories of students who maybe hadn't even prepared that much, and they were pretty relaxed, and they kind of went to take the test almost as the actual exam, almost as an expensive practice test. I can think of one guy, and his practice tests, I think, were 680, 690. Actually, no, I take that back. His last practice test was a 660. And he was just getting rolling with his studying. It was the holidays were about to hit here in the US. His last practice test was a 660. He had a test scheduled. He's like, well, I'm going to have to eat the fee anyway. It's too late to cancel and get my money back. So I'm just going to go take it. What the heck? Laid back guy, really funny guy. He calls me after his exam and he's laughing too hard to tell me the score. He got a 720. So again, 660 to 720. And again, how common is this? Not very common. I maybe see one or two of them a year, maybe three at most, for all the students that we run across. But in his case, I think it was a combination of, his learning curve was still on the upswing, and he walked in totally relaxed. He had nothing to lose. He knew it was a practice test. He was just taking it because he'd scheduled it. He was going to lose the fee anyway. And he went in totally relaxed and kind of focused in the right ways. And for him, that really worked. So that can happen. I can think of another student I had a little more recently, very, very similar. Practice tests were high 500s. He walks in and gets a 650. So he goes from about a 590 to a 650. Same deal. That guy was kind of a funny dude. Calls me up laughing to tell me the score because he thought it was so hilarious. He got a 650. All right. Well, what happened in both of those cases? Yep. Relaxed guys. That's a big part of it. The test wasn't, they knew it was kind of a practice test. They took it easy, helped these particular two individuals focus in the right ways. One other thing to keep in mind, and this is, I think, not very interesting or actionable, frankly, is that there is a little bit of natural variability from day to day. And I could talk a blue streak about measurement error in those tests. I'm going to put you all to sleep if I do that. But you could think of sort of these questions. So if you go see your 31 quant questions, essentially it's a sample of 31 questions from a broader pool of questions. It's almost like taking an opinion poll for something like a presidential election. Well, if you take 31 random questions out of this pool, there's going to be some sampling error, and your score is going to vary a little bit from day to day, depending on exactly which questions you see, even if your performance is totally steady. So to some extent, I think these guys that kind of see that random bump on test day, I think are benefiting from that natural variability. And that's part of why we don't see it very often, is that statistically speaking, if there's no such thing as test anxiety and everybody performs exactly the same all the time as they do on their practice tests, we'd occasionally see those, right? So 2% of the time, students would randomly do better by 60 points. So probably pretty academic. I think it's an interesting question that was asked there. But yeah, it does happen occasionally. It's very, very rare. It tends to be relaxed people, don't have a lot at stake, and get a little bit lucky. It can happen. Obviously, you're not going to bank on that. All right. Wow, the questions are piling up. I'm going to do my best here, guys. So one from, and again, apologies for any pronunciation slaughters, Niyati. Do you have any tips of bailing? And I'm not exactly sure what you mean with that. My interpretation of that is bailing on questions when you're struggling, which is part of why I wanted to pick on this question. Look, on quant, if you start to struggle on a question, so one of the things that can cause these wild swings in your scores, and I'll focus on quant here. We could say something similar about verbal. I think it's easier to illustrate with quant. One of the reasons we see all of this instability, yes, it's an unsystematic approach, but in a very specific sense. If you're taking too long on questions because you're stubborn on quant, that's one of the things that can cause your test to be very, very different from day to day. So when you say the word bailing, Niyati, and I have no idea if this is what you meant by it. Look, unless you're a wonderful, talented freak of nature, you're going to see questions on quant in particular that you're going to struggle on. Most of the tutors at my company, most of them are smarter than I am. They go take the test and they say, yeah, there were 3 questions that I really struggled. And maybe they get them right, maybe they don't. But even if you know what you're doing and you could recite, I could probably still recite the 12th edition of the official guide to you. Yeah, I go take the test. There's a bunch of questions I struggle on. That's just reality. They find new ways to put these puzzles together. And I'd love to say, hey guys, I'm so brilliant. This is easy for me. I can crush the quant in 25 minutes. BS. I struggle. I use every minute of the time, every time. There's never been an exception. I struggle to get through. Now that's going to be the experience for everybody. I've been tutoring for 20 years. I still struggle to get through because some of the questions I go, what am I supposed to do here? And I stare at it. Now, the worst thing you can possibly do is stare at it forever. And the temptation is, I got to get this one. I got to get this one. I'm close. I'm close. 8 minutes later, you're still there. And then you feel the time pressure and you start going crazy and you start rushing through. You make sloppy errors. You run out of time at the end. Nothing good can come of spending more than 3 minutes on a question on quant. Verbal is a little bit different because you might spend more time on the first question of a reading comp passage, but you've got to learn to bail. If you're in trouble on a question, on quant in particular, you've got to learn to get out of there. So when I talk about unsystematic approach or developing a systematic approach on quant, a big part of it is when you're in trouble on a question, let go of it. It is absolutely, absolutely crucial. And again, Yadi, I'm not sure if that's quite what you meant, but if that's something you're interested in, there's a video on the GMATNinja YouTube channel that Mike does talking about how to manage your time on quant. And it just focuses on, hey, when you're in trouble on a question, bail, get out of there. Your job as a test taker, allocate your time in the most efficient way possible. 8 minutes on a question is not efficient. Most of the folks that I showed in the video who are struggling with their consistency, yeah, for different reasons. Most of them, maybe all 4 of them, were doing that. So be really aware of that. Okay. Wow, there's a ton here. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm glad I had that. Was answering the right question. Getting a lot of questions about practice tests, and I'm struggling a little bit to keep up with all these, but I think I've seen 3 or 4 in here about which practice tests. So I'll pick on, and again, apologies for pronunciation, Shivatsa, how to practice taking tests if one has exhausted all official GMAT tests. Yeah, it's a great question. One answer is from the very start, if you are fairly new to studying for the GMAT, be really, really careful with those official tests. You definitely want to keep at least 1 or 2 of those 6 official tests in your pocket for when you're really close to your exam. If that ship has already sailed, you've already used them all, you're on your 5th retake of the actual exam, whatever it is. It's a tough thing. I think for quant, I'm pretty comfortable to a degree with non-official tests. So if you want to go do tests from Manhattan or GMAT Club or whoever for quant, I think that's fine. I think what you want to be really, really aware of is that when you do a quant practice test, your score might not be very accurate. So I'll pick on Manhattan a little bit. Actually, I'll pick on GMAT Club since we're here, and I know and absolutely adore all of the people who have been involved in making those tests. Some of those questions are hard, and I don't think a GMAT Club quant test necessarily feels like the real thing because some of those questions are vicious. And I think that if let's say that you're a student scoring in the mid 40s on quant, my personal opinion, and results may vary, and you guys can hash this out a little bit more in the chat, and I might make the GMAT Club team pretty angry with this. But I'm not going to be shy here. I think if you're kind of scoring in the mid 40s, let's say, and you're trying to get into the high 40s or low 50s on quant, and you go take a GMAT Club test for the first time, I think you're going to feel like it's way more difficult than the official tests. Now, what is that going to do to your score? Well, it depends, right? Sometimes you feel like you're just getting punched in the face over and over in a way that's not totally realistic. And the score kind of washes out and it is pretty realistic. And other times, you might get a score that's way lower than what you're really scoring, or higher for that matter. It's so hard to get that algorithm right. It's so hard to get the scoring system right. It's so hard to get the questions right. Again, GMAT spends thousands of dollars, thousands, on every individual test question. So look, don't take the scores too seriously if you take a non-official test for quant. What I do want you to pay attention to, look at questions over 3 minutes on your quant tests and look for careless errors. So really underlying all this variability, when I talk about unsystematic approaches or anxiety or fatigue, what's really driving that, I guess the bad side of those scores, those low scores, it's errors on questions you're capable of getting right. That's the real story. And we're just breaking down ways that happens. So any test you do, whether it's official, non-official, quant, verbal, doesn't matter. What I want you to really focus on is where were the errors on questions that I could have got. I know how to do it, and I made a careless error. I did something silly. I misread something. I read it too fast. Not misread it because it was hard to understand. I just jumped over a couple words and misread it because I was in a hurry. That's the thing you want to improve on. So let's say that you do a GMAT Club test, and let's say that let's say that you're scoring a 45, and that's kind of where your score is right now. If you were to take the actual GMAT, you go take a GMAT Club test, you get demolished by it, you feel like garbage, you get a 39, and it felt really, really hard. And you go, I'm at a 39. No, you might still be at a 45. It doesn't necessarily mean exactly what it looks like it means, but I want you to go through and look for those 2 things. questions over 3 minutes, should you have bailed out on that question and spent that time elsewhere? And number 2, where were the questions that you should have had that were sloppy errors, misreads, that kind of thing? You fix those 2 things on your non-official quant practice tests. Yeah, it's going to feel different when you get to an actual exam because the questions are different, but you're going to be in really good shape. You fix those 2 things, become systematic, manage your time really well, no careless errors, you're going to be great. Verbal, that's the really tough one. If you've exhausted all the GMAT official tests, we tend to rely really heavily on LSATs with our students. That's a little bit unfair in a way because we're here to interpret those tests for them. And if you watch any of my verbal videos for critical reasoning or reading comp that I've done here at GMAT Club, I talk a lot about LSATs. In some of those, I kind of talk about metrics that we're looking for. What I'll typically say, and you can watch some of their videos for a deeper dive on it, the reading comp videos in particular. If somebody's goal is a 40 on verbal, I'll say, okay, I want you doing these LSAT sections, which are very consistent from section to section. Official questions, thousands of dollars spent on each one, same quality. Cosmetic differences from the GMAT, but the results on LSAT for critical reasoning reading comp correlate really, really, really strongly to GMAT results. If you're going for a 40 verbal, for example, and you could do an LSAT set in under an hour, and you can get 80% right or better, I'm feeling pretty good about your chances. So if you've already kind of burned through your official GMAT test or you're trying to save them for later, LSAT sometimes provide good data. Really hard on verbal though, guys. There's no substitute for sentence correction. And that's where it gets really, really hard is you don't get anything that mimics the exact time pressure of the GMAT with questions that are realistic. I think non-official verbal tests that's a really, really tough thing. They're incredibly hard to produce. We can argue about the quality of one versus the other, but they're almost never accurate. They're almost never true to the experience. So on verbal, that's why we use LSAT so heavily and try to get a sense of your speed. And again, if you're systematic in your approach and your speed is fine, go to the test, do the same thing, you'll be okay. But for verbal, it's tough. You're not going to get a really good clean score and clean experience once you've already burnt through those official tests. It's a really tough thing. All right. Trying to pick my battles wisely on these questions. Keep them coming, guys. Oh, wow. A whole bunch more just popped up. Let's see. Any suggestions? Yeah, I got a question here about IR. And I spend very, very little time on IR in general and in our videos and with our students, just because it has such a small impact on admissions. Quick aside on that. So last MBA Spotlight back in June, we actually we had a nice panel discussion with so Krishma was there, the fantastic tutor. The admissions directors from Ross and Emory were there. Maria from Applicant Lab, and had a really, really good conversation about GMAT versus GRE and how these scores get interpreted. On the topic of IR, so the question here from Tato Weirer, sorry for the pronunciation. IR scores have gone from 7 to 4 to 6 to 3. 2 things. The smallest side is that what schools are trying to discover is that IR actually correlates really well to performance in business school. It's actually more predictive, apparently, according to internal data, than your composite score is. Now, it's still not being used that way. I don't think anybody's taking it super seriously, but I find it interesting that IR seems to correlate really well to performance in business school. But that doesn't matter. Nobody's taking it into account really seriously in admissions. At least I haven't gotten any really credible reports of it. But that might be coming someday. Nothing that I think you guys right now watching this, taking the GMAT in the next 6 months or whatever, you guys don't have to worry about it. But for what it's worth, I think it might get more important. Right now, it's not. But this question, IR scores have gone from 7 to 4 to 6 to 3. I would bet anything that it's some of these same factors. And seeing that much swing, I bet this is unsystematicness. And my quick wisecrack about IR, we do see our students' IR scores go up, even though we very rarely address IR explicitly. And the reason is that a lot of what we're training people to do on quant and verbal is, yeah, quant. It's going to sound really dumb. Read twice. Read the question twice. It's such a dumb thing. But if you misread that question, you are screwed. You're in trouble. You're going to start making careless errors. So when we talk about systematic approaches, this is going to sound so dumb, but step 1 is read the freaking quant question twice. Every time, do it religiously. And I've got a lot more to say about what systematic means. You can go watch some of our videos on that. Branson has a great one on the GMATNinja channel. I rant about systematicness on quant during the Ukraine marathon, other places where you can get that. But I'll bet anything that if your IR scores are swinging like that, you're getting stubborn. there are some questions where you decide to just dig in your heels and you spend 12 minutes on one question and then you got to scramble elsewhere. And number two, you're misreading. You're not reading carefully. Guarantee it. So many IR questions, none of it's rocket surgery. Some of those questions can get hard, don't get me wrong, but there's really not new skills beyond what you see on quant and verbal. I can bet anything you're making mistakes because of misreading, maybe the occasional miscalculation. And more than anything, I would guarantee that if I could see the times on those 4 tests, we have a 7 to 4, a 6 to 3, you're getting stubborn. And by the way, IR is not adaptive. There's nothing special about the first few questions. What we usually tell students is you're not getting through 12 questions comfortably on IR in 30 minutes. It's just not going to happen. It is, unless you're a freak of nature, it is just too hard. It goes too fast. Do 7 or 8 or 9 questions really well, really carefully, read twice, watch your back, check your work, and your scores are going to stabilize. So, if you got a 7 and a 6 on a couple of those tests, obviously the talent's there. You're misreading, you're going too fast on some, and you're getting stubborn on others. I would almost guarantee that's the case. All right. What could accuracy levels? What's important? Yeah, that's actually a good question. And I realize I'm swerving all over the road and we're getting a little bit away from the theme of consistency. Question from Pratik. What's more important for sentence correction, answering on a grammatical sense or answering on a technical basis? I would actually, you're probably neither of those. I think it's sentence correction. And again, tons and tons of videos you can find here on the GMAT Club channel or the GMATNinja channel where we talk about good approaches to sentence correction. It's one of the areas where I think it's most important to keep your process really systematic. I guess it's true of all of them. But don't overdo the grammar. 2 steps on sentence correction. If you've watched a bunch of our videos, you've heard me say this too many times. Your first step is, if you see really easy eliminations on sentence correction, take it. So that's the grammar part. But the thing about sentence correction to keep in mind as you study is that there aren't that many hard and fast rules that always work. They're rare. They're super rare. You name a rule, I can write an exception on the board right now that would totally fly on the GMAT. There are very, very few ironclad rules. If you start to go too grammar fundamentalist with this, you can get yourself into trouble. Are there rules that are worth knowing? Things that are worth knowing about grammar? Absolutely. And I've got, however many dozens of hours of stuff on here on the GMAT Club channel talking about the things you should know about sentence correction. So technical, sure, good. Grammar, good, up to a point. If that's all you do, you're going to get yourself into trouble, because really what they're after is which of these sentences is correct, clear, logical, does the best job of expressing a reasonable, logical idea that would make sense. So if you go pure grammar, you're going to get into trouble. You're going to have a ceiling. So yes, grammar is important. Step 1, the way we usually teach it, is look for those easy errors. Those will often be grammar-based or kind of usage rule-based. Step 2, then I need you to think really carefully about meaning. As you start to compare the remaining answer choices and say, what's different between these two? That's where you need to start thinking about, well, okay, what does this difference between these two answer choices do in terms of the meaning? If you can get really good at parsing that, after you've plucked the low-hanging fruit, easy eliminations first, subject-verb agreement, you see a subject-verb error, cross it out quickly. Be efficient. That's where your efficiency comes from. But it's only going to get you about half of the wrong answers eliminated on average over a large sample of sentence correction questions. So then you need to start focusing on meaning. And again, plenty of videos that we have up on the GMAT Club channel getting into that. Great comment here. And I apologize. At this point, I have no prayer getting to all the questions, and I'm being semi-random in these. But Kusnir, again, apologies for the pronunciation. Thank you for this again. Really interesting comment here. Official questions don't have traps. Correct. There are not traps. There's not gimmicky stuff on official questions. I'm going to say that again. I hear this all the time. I need to learn how to not fall into traps. Don't think of the test that way. They're trying really hard to be fair and create the same testing experience for everybody over decades. There's no gimmicks. There's no traps. Is GMAT perfect? No, they make mistakes. I can point out a lot of them, but they really work hard at making sure the test is fair, consistent, not gimmicky. There's no traps. We sometimes use that term when we teach, but traps are of your own making. So, hey, I made a mistake with a negative on that quant question. I fell into a negative trap. That's your trap. That trap exists in your head. You botched the math is what happened. They were giving you a fair question. There happened to be a negative in it. The trap is yours. You did it. So there are no traps. Usually when we meet students who are overly concerned about traps, they start overthinking going, well, I didn't want to pick the right answer because I thought it was a trap. No. If it's the right answer, it's the right answer. Be systematic. So great question, Kusnior, because I think that is when we talk about developing a systematic approach. And again, that's 40 hours of videos, not 40 minutes, to talk about what that really means on different question types. But one big part of it is don't get wrapped up in the gimmicks and the silliness. There's no traps. Answer the question, do it the same way every time. And if it feels like the question is too easy, double check your work. But maybe you have the right answer, move on. And if you start thinking, oh, maybe it's a trap, you start crapping away easy questions, you get yourself into trouble. But you will notice, to Kusnier's point here, unofficial ones do have traps. Sometimes they get gimmicky. Again, this stuff's hard. It is really hard to write great questions in the style of GMAT. So this is no shot at anybody who writes those questions. Certainly not all the brilliant people. Buñuel, top of the list. GMAT Club test questions. But yeah, you'll sometimes see traps in there. And I think Buñuel does a very nice job of not making them gimmicky. But again, he's one of the best out there. All right. Good question that just popped in from Janesh. What are the behavior flaws that one should note in his or her approach in the verbal section during prep? Yeah, that is a great question. I guess it depends on what you mean by behavior flaws. But what I want everybody here to do as you're studying for verbal in particular, part of why I'm a little bit obsessed with LSATs is they're all really consistent. They're meant to be done. If you're taking the LSAT, 25 questions, 35 minutes. Don't do them that quickly. That's going to make your brain explode. It's not how the GMAT works. LSAT's time pressured a different way. Try to do them in under an hour. But more importantly, try to get your process right. Do it the same way every time. Again, you can watch tons of videos on that from us and plenty of other, good teachers out there. But part of why I like those LSATs is every set is very consistent. 25 questions, roughly the same difficulty. What you're looking for in your results is consistency. So if what you're seeing is, well, hey, one day I was at 63 minutes, the next day I was at 51, and then I was at 56, and then 45, and then 68 again, you've got a consistency problem. Your process is different on different days. So it's not necessarily, it's a really hard thing. And it's Janesh's fantastic question. What are the behavioral flaws? We could probably write a 300-page book about that and what drives that inconsistency. And this is obviously the short version in this video. But I guess I would say that what is very actionable for everybody is if you're doing LSATs that are nice and consistent for reading, comp, and critical reasoning, the LSATs will yell at you if there's a behavior flaw there. Your errors will be different from set to set. Don't make excuses for it. Figure out what's driving it. Something is driving it. A question or two, fine. If it's -2 one day, -3 the next, -2, -4, that's in a reasonable range. That's fine. But if you see more than a 5 or 7 minute swing from set to set, it's you. Something's going on. If you see more than a 2 or 3 error difference from set to set, it's you. So if you're -11 one day, -1 on the next, and I'm thinking of a particular student I worked with a year or two ago, and he insisted it was the LSAT. And I'm like, no, these are totally standardized. There's tiny bit of variation from set to set. It's minimal. It's you. It's your process. Maybe you didn't sleep enough. Maybe you had too many Red Bulls. Maybe you didn't have enough Red Bulls, whatever it is. But I would let the data tell you about those behavior flaws. If you're taking official tests and you see those swings and scores, something's going on there. It's not the test. It's you. You're doing something different. It's a matter of figuring out what that is. And again, it might be physical. It might be something to do with anxiety. Maybe it's external in the sense that there happened to be a barking dog outside your room when you're doing the practice test. Fair enough. But if you see a lot of that, it's your process, right? You're doing different things on different days with the questions. Maybe it's quant, maybe it's reading comp, maybe it's sentence correction, whatever. But the single most important thing is look at your results and try to go, wait a minute, if I'm seeing swings in results on sets that are totally comparable or tests that are comparable, something's going on there, and you have to dig deep and try to figure out what it is. And yeah, kind of similar question here. What do you do if you're out of official mocks? What's the next best measure of, okay, this is my score range and I'm ready for the test? Yeah, I mean, I answered a version of this before, but I lean on LSATs in those situations. I think to some extent you can lean on non-official quant tests. quant only and say, no careless errors, good time management, no stubbornness, then you're probably as ready as you're going to be on quant. But at that point, there's not a whole lot you can do there. All right, what else do we have here? Got some specific questions. Yeah, so Bobber, great name. How to get rid of test anxiety. This is another thing that, again, could be and is entire books worth. I think if I'm going to give you the short version, if I had to pick one, I'd say thing one, be honest with yourself about it. You got to identify it first. And it's a hard thing to be honest about. These sorts of things are still stigmatized in most cultures. I realize people are watching from all over the world. But honestly, in most cultures on the planet, that's still stigmatized. Saying that you need help, I think, especially for men, depending on the culture, and saying, yeah, my head's not right, my psychology's not right, it's hard. We're trained to suck it up. And that's changed some in American culture. I grew up in a small town in Iowa. You suck it up. You don't talk about your problems. If you feel anxious, you nut up and you keep going. And that's how people raise their kids where I grew up. It's bad for you. Be honest with yourself. And if you see those swings in performance, especially that drop off from your practice test to your actual test, that may well be it, whether you feel consciously nervous or not. So step one, be honest. Beyond that, I think there are a bunch of things that can help. Part of why we end up thinking so much about exercise, and we know this absolutely fantastic personal trainer that we send people to, he has a psychology degree. But there's a strong link between exercise and anxiety. So exercise mimics that feeling of, your heart's pounding and you're short of breath. Get comfortable with that. If you never exercise, starting to do exercise cardio in particular can actually really help your test anxiety. There's studies on that. That's one factor. Sleep, lack of sleep can contribute to test anxiety. There's actually a lot of research coming out about your gut microbiome and anxiety. So that can contribute. So if your diet's really messed up and every meal you eat is from 7-Eleven and you're on a diet of Cheetos and taquitos from 7-Eleven, no offense to 7-Eleven. If you guys want to sponsor some GMAT videos, let me know. If that's your diet, yeah, that can contribute too. Those are the things that are feel a little bit out there, but they matter. Take good care of your body. The more important ones arguably are, is it worth seeing some sort of performance coach? So sports psychologists, and we've gone down the road, I've gone down the road personally over the last 5 years of talking to psychologists of all sorts of stripes and sending students over to them to help with the test anxiety. The approach that we found to be the most effective isn't conventional talk therapy. It's a sports psychologist who deals specifically with mental performance coaching. And if you're a sports fan, and I realize with the kind of international crowd watching this, I may easily pick the wrong sport here, but you think about baseball or golf, and how psychological it is to putt with a bunch of people watching you. So a lot of sports psychology came from golf, if you're at all familiar with that sport. Baseball, you'll see these great Major League Baseball players, these stars in the American Baseball League, who all of a sudden can't play anymore because they can no longer throw to first base. Instead of throwing where the ball going where they want it to go, it starts flying, right? That's called the yips in baseball terms. Soccer, you sometimes see it. Goalies, penalty kicks, all of a sudden a guy who is a star striker in soccer, football, depending on what part of the world you're in, all of a sudden can't hit a penalty kick. That's psychological. So a lot of these guys employ sports psychologists to help them through it. Very, very, very common. LeBron James has a whole team of sports psychologists. So does Steph Curry if you're an NBA fan. So that's one approach. And that gives you very concrete tactics, reset routines, ways to reframe your anxiety. So that's one road you can go down. The other one I referenced earlier, mindfulness training. Meditation is one part of that. It's not the only part of it. Again, huge body of research on all these things. Everything I'm saying here is rooted in science. Often these studies are pretty new. I mean, these are emerging fields in science, especially around the gut biome and anxiety. But in the last 10 years, there's been a whole lot of new research on it. But mindfulness meditation improves your working memory, improves your test score performance. There's a study done on GRE students, peer-reviewed study. Meditation helps. Mindfulness training in particular, which isn't just meditation, helps you stay in the moment, get those distracting thoughts out of your head, which is really what it comes down to. That yap in your head when you start getting anxious, how do you get rid of it? mindfulness meditation is one tool. Talk to a sports psychologist, mental performance coach. And then again, all the physical stuff, you don't need to spend a lot of money to do that. Get your diet right, get some sleep, get some exercise, just go run around for a little bit. But whatever your exercise of choice is, it can really, really make a difference. And again, tons more resources on that. Both on our website, GMAT Club has a growing body of content on that as well. All right. Got a nice question here about ESRs, and I just lost our ESR is helpful from Parag. And again, apologies as always for my pronunciations. Should we opt for GMAT offline over GMAT online? Two different questions there, both of which I think are really good. ESRs. For this particular conversation, why is there inconsistency in your scores? I actually think ESRs are really good. Because sometimes if you have no idea what's happening and you're like, I scored 80 points lower than my practice test, what happened? Sometimes the ESR lifts the veil up on that a little bit and you kind of see what's going on. And the kinds of things you might see clumping of errors where it's in the first quarter of a section where you get annihilated and you miss the first 5 out of 7 or the last 5 out of 7. Or you can see that your time management was wacky and you spent 3 minutes per question in the middle of the test and had to scramble at the end or whatever. So you want to look for those kinds of anomalies that can sometimes point you to something. Now, the limitation of ESR is two huge limitations. Number one, you're going to be tempted to look at the breakdown by topic. Oh, well, on counting sets and series, I only got 50% right. I need to study that. Careful. It might have been 2 questions, literally. There's so few questions. So quant, 31 questions, 3 are experimental, 28 questions are scored. Only those 28 questions show up on your ESR. So then they divide that into 5 or 6 different subtopics or sub areas, geometry and algebra and whatever. And sometimes those are just 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions. And why you perform badly on, let's say, counting sets and series might just be dumb luck. You happen to see a really hard one. You happen to see 2 really hard ones. You were out of time at the end, and that's where you saw the 2 that you missed. They don't always mean what they look like it means. And I could say the same about verbal. Critical reasoning versus reading comp versus sentence correction. There are 30 questions that are scored on verbal, 6 experimental. So 30 questions are in that data in your ESR. So about 10 per question type, roughly. So what does it really mean if there's a 20 percentile point difference between your critical reasoning and your sentence correction? I don't think that means much. That's too small of a difference to really matter. That could just be dumb luck. Now, if you see a huge one, so you're at 5th percentile, think of somebody specific here, 5th percentile in critical reasoning, 91st in reading comp, real example, Ross graduate, lover, worked out for it in the end. Something's going on there. Something's happening when you see that big of a discrepancy. So take it with a grain of salt. There's a video up on the GMATNinja channel. I'm sure there's tons of them on GMAT Club too. I haven't done one personally, but I'm sure there's some good ones. We have a short one on the GMATNinja channel talking about what ESRs are good for, what they're not good for. So very, very helpful when you have absolutely no idea. It gives you a starting point. I wish it could tell you more about the why, but it'll at least tell you where you start running off the rails, ends of sections, beginnings. Maybe sentence correction or critical reasoning. Maybe it's a time management thing. Maybe you can see the careless errors because you're missing easy questions, and it'll show you that. If you're missing easy questions on average in a certain chunk of the test, you can see that. So helpful in that sense. Take them with a grain of salt. I think it's some of the precision in there isn't as valuable as it looks. GMAT offline versus online. It doesn't matter. The tests are identical. Again, it bends over backwards. I mean, they spend millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to keep the test standardized, fair for everybody, same experience for everybody. It doesn't matter if you take it online or offline. There's all kinds of rumors. Online's harder, total BS. It's the same. But in the context of this conversation, inconsistency, think about where you're the most comfortable. For me personally, at this point, I mean, I'm banned from getting an 800 years ago. But if I were to take the GMAT online, I've got a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old at home. That's a terrible idea. I should not take a GMAT at home. It would be a disaster unless I get rid of everybody. But then the dog next door is going to start barking. I would probably have a much harder time concentrating at home. I'm better off in a test center. I don't mind all the typing people. But it might be different for you personally. Some people get in that test center environment and it raises that anxiety. Other people might be too relaxed or distracted at home. It just depends on you. We definitely have met students that feel much, much better at home doing the online test. If that's the case for you, by all means, do it at home. If it's the opposite for you, your wife stresses you out, get into the test center. So, but again, be honest with yourself about kind of what drives you personally. All right, 4 more minutes here. What else do we have here? How many? Yeah, great question here. From, again, apologies for mispronunciations. How many consistent scores are enough to indicate range? Yeah. I wish there was a great answer to that, because it's a wonderful, wonderful question. When we look at our students' results, we're using different pieces of data, right? So we have homework results on things that aren't totally standardized. So if you do 2 different sets of, let's say, 25 sentence correction questions, you do 1 set from the verbal guide, you do 1 set from the official guide, one's in the middle, let's say middle of the verbal guide, end of the official guide. Well, yeah, they're different difficulties. So how consistent should those 2 sets of 25 be? Might not be totally consistent with each other, even if you as the student are totally consistent. But we still get a sense, right? So after we kind of look at this mountain of data, we say, okay, are these performances roughly stable? Do I all of a sudden see a bunch of boneheaded errors on sentence correction on one day and none the other? If that's the case, we got something to work out. Maybe it's process, that the student is kind of forgetting what they're trying to do on sentence correction. They start going by ear and just start picking stuff instead of going through their process the way we teach them. Possible that's that. But we already have some idea from other sources of data, even if the data is imperfect. And I know that that's unsatisfying when we say that to folks who are self-studying. But I think the way you want to analyze your results is to say, where am I seeing not bad performances, and I got beat? You're going to miss hard questions on the GMAT. You're going to miss a bunch of them. That's great. Like I said, every brilliant tutor I know, and I know a bunch of them, everybody struggles. The one who say they don't, good for them. But I'm not sure I believe them. You're going to have questions that throw you, and you really kind of run through mud. Even if you're great at this stuff, and if you're somebody who's striving to get to a 700, and that's going to be a challenge for you, yeah, it's going to feel really hard. You might have a dozen questions on each section that you really, really struggle on, and that's normal. So what do we care about? Adaptive tests. Don't beat yourself. Don't miss the easy ones. Don't miss the ones that are easy for you. So as you analyze your results, so when you ask the question, it's wonderful, how many consistent scores? I guess I'd say that kind of that analysis of, are you ready? Are you consistent? I think starts with everything else you're doing. So every piece of homework you do, every time you sit down and do a set from the official guide or whatever, ask yourself, did I make boneheaded errors? Was my process good? Does this match my last couple sets, or did I have a dip in performance? Got to take it with a grain of salt, because different sets are different difficulties. But you should be keeping an eye on that from the very, very start. Oh, I botched a couple of negatives. I botched a couple of easy fractions. Here was the question where 4 times 7 was 32. So you should know that you're consistent before you even get to practice tests, right? You should see that. The question of how many practice tests do you need to know that you're in your desired range, that's a hard one. I think we've had students for sure where we say, and this wouldn't necessarily be our preferred playbook, but let's say somebody comes in and they've already taken the first 4 official practice tests. They only have the 2 left that are really going to give you an accurate score. And let's say they've done those first 4 3 times each. So they're total garbage, right? I'm okay with those 2 tests, but only once I know they're consistent elsewhere. And I'm pretty confident their LSATs are consistent. They're not making silly errors on quant. They're not making silly errors on sentence correction. I've seen their process. It's really clean. All the signs of consistency are there on all of their homework. No careless errors on their let's say their GMAT Club quant tests. No stubbornness on their GMAT Club quant test. Nothing over 3 minutes, or at least nothing much over 3 minutes. They're not chasing questions they're never going to catch. When I see all that, I'm actually good with 2 tests. If those 2 are kind of in their range, I'm good. 2 can be enough. 1 can be enough. If you're stuck with it, would I like to see more data? Yeah, I wish there were 20 official practice tests. There aren't, unfortunately. All right, top of the hour. I got to get out of here. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And if you're here live, please don't be shy. Go into these private, totally private, unrecorded Zoom sessions. We've got Kelly and Fuqua starting at the top of the hour here. I think ISB is still going. Talk to students, network, get any chance you can. If you're an applicant, don't do it in stealth. Talk to students, get to know the schools. The more you know about the school, the more it's going to help your applications. So go enjoy the rest of MBA Spotlight. And thank you, everybody, for the wonderful questions. If I didn't get to your question, feel free to tag me somewhere on the forum, and I'll do my best to follow up. All right. Thank you, everybody, and have fun studying.